This micro lesson is on Graham Greene, another one of the modernist writers who combined much of his writing with humor as well as pathos. We will be looking a little bit into how he combined fun and sorrow and made light of it, especially in his excerpt, A Shocking Accident. He was definitely born around the modernistic era, 1904, and he died in 1991. He came from a not a very large family, but a somewhat large family. He had five siblings, inclusive of himself. He was six. There were six of them, and he was a great writer. His talent in writing came out at an early age. We learned that his biggest success was Orient Express, one of his writings, which many readers enjoyed because they found it very entertaining. Another one of his writings, which was very deep and was more focused towards the mind and the psychological issues of the people of his day, was The Heart of the Matter. It focused more on human suffering. It talked a little bit about religion, and it talked about the search for salvation, how God and God's intervention can bring hope in salvation. This story that we're going to be looking at very briefly is called A Shocking Accident. And in this, he focuses more on the psychological dimensions of character. So we are going to look at um, a different kind of a situation that he presents where within his writing there are undertones of humor. It's um, it's very humorous in a sad context, and this was one of the attributes of his writing as a modernistic writer. He wanted to bring laughter out of sadness because there was a lot of sadness. People were very depressed after the world wars. We know a little bit about how fragmented the minds and the lives of the people were. So, in the midst of that, um, Graham Greene was trying to bring about humor. And he uses three basic types of humor. And we will be looking at a small excerpt of his writing and try to identify one or two situations of each of these. So, in the three basic types of humors that he talks about, there's the humor of situation. The humor of situation involves an exaggerated or an event that is kind of absurd or weird. That would be the humor of situation. He then also talks about humor of character. This focuses on characters within the story who cannot recognize their own flaws. So, in other words, they're talking about the flaws of others, but they, they're not able to recognize similar flaws within themselves. And then there's humor of language. And humor of language uses puns and wordplay. Uh, and you all know what a pun is. So he uses humor of language as well. So in the midst of all of this humor, he uses pathos. If you remember, pathos is the quality of evoking sympathy or sorrow. When you read something that has pathos in it, you usually the intention of the author is to make you feel sad or to give you a sense of sympathy for what he or she is writing about. So, taking all of this into consideration, um, I would like to bring about a little bit of the book that we're going to be looking at, and we're going to focus on um, one of these writings from one of the first paragraphs that he talks about. So here we go. I'm going to start reading from paragraph 1, and I'm going to stop somewhere in the middle of the next page. So we're looking at page 892, shocking accident. Jerome was called into his housemaster's room in the break between the second and third class on a Thursday morning. He had no fear of trouble, for he was a warden, the name that the proprietor and headmaster of a rather expensive preparatory school had chosen to give to proved reliable boys in the lower forms. From a warden one became a guardian, and finally, before leaving, it was hoped for Marlborough or Rugby, a crusader. The housemaster, Mr. Wordsworth, sat behind his desk with an appearance of perplexity and apprehension. Jerome had the odd impression when he entered that he was a cause of fear. "Sit down, Jerome," Mr. Wordsworth said. "All going well with trigonometry?" "Yes, sir. I've had a telephone call, Jerome, from your aunt. I'm afraid I have bad news for you." "Yes, sir." "Your father has had an accident." "Oh?" Mr. Wordsworth looked at him with some surprise. "A serious accident?" "Yes, sir." Jerome worshipped his father. The verb is exact. As man recreates God, so Jerome recreated his father, from a restless, widowed author into a mysterious adventurer who travelled in far places, Nice, Beirut, Majorca, even the Canaries. The time had arrived about his 8th birthday when Jerome believed that his father either ran gun or was a member of the British Secret Service. Now it occurred to him that his father might have been wounded in a hail of machine-gun bullets. Mr. Wordsworth played with the ruler on his desk. He seemed at a loss how to continue. He said, "You knew your father was in Naples?" "Yes, sir." "Your aunt heard from the hospital today?" "Oh?" Mr. Wordsworth said with desperation. "It was a street accident." "Yes, sir." It seemed quite likely to Jerome that they would call it a street accident. The police, of course, had fired first. His father would not take human life except as a last resort. "I'm afraid your father was very seriously hurt indeed." "Oh." "In fact, Jerome, he died yesterday, quite without pain." "Did they shoot him through the heart?" "I beg your pardon?" "What did you say, Jerome?" "Did they shoot him through the heart?" "Nobody shot him, Jerome. A pig fell on him." An inexplicable convulsion took place in the nerves of Mr. Wordsworth's face. It really looked for a moment as though he were going to laugh. He closed his eyes, composed his features, and said rapidly, as though it were necessary to expel the story as rapidly as possible, "Your father was walking along a street in Naples when a pig fell on him. A shocking accident. Apparently in the poorer quarters of Naples they keep pigs on the balconies. This one was on the 5th floor. It had grown too fat. The balcony broke. The pig fell on your father." Mr. Wordsworth left his desk rapidly and went to the window, turning his back on Jerome. He shook a little with emotion. Jerome said, "What happened to the pig?" So I'm not going to read the rest of the story, which I hope you will take some time to read it. As you can see, there's a little bit of humor in this alongside um, sadness. Obviously, it is very clear that Jerome's father has died, and the humor about all of this is the fact that he died from something that was really, really awkward. A pig fell on him. I'm sure many of us, not any of us, have heard of someone dying from a pig or any animal falling on them. So that in itself um, causes a kind of a humorous, brings about a kind of a humorous situation. So if you look back and remember what I said about a humor of situation would be something that is an absurd event. So from looking at the reading between here and page 894, you can see that um, when Jerome and him are talking, where um, he's asking Mr. Wordsworth how his father had died, and he presumed that his father had died with a gunshot. He says, Mr. Wordsworth says down here, "Nobody shot him, Jerome. A pig fell on him." That would be considered a humor of situation. We're going to be coming across many more situations like this as you continue to read the story. I will not be reading it with you, but this is what would be considered then a humor of situation because this is a very absurd event. It's not something that ordinarily happens where a pig falls on someone, let alone kills him or her. Um, if you want to look at the humor of character, humor of character would be someone who cannot recognize his own faults. So let's take a look over here, where at the bottom of page 893, we're looking at Mr. Wordsworth, and he says, "Nobody shot him, Jerome. A pig fell on him." An inexplicable convulsion took place in the nerves of Mr. Wordsworth's face. It really looked for a moment as though he were going to laugh. This would be considered then humor of character. Mr. Wordsworth is actually finding the situation rather funny. He wants to laugh, but of course he's trying to compose himself because he doesn't want to laugh in front of Jerome, obviously. Um, but at the same time, when as you continue to read and when you see that Jerome questions him in an odd way, Mr. Wordsworth kind of shows indignation as to Jerome being questioning him as to what might have happened. So, in other words, Mr. Wordsworth is finding the situation really funny. He actually does want to laugh out loud, but he's holding it inside. So, this would be a humor of character because as a matter of fact, Jerome himself is finding it funny. Obviously, he's not going to laugh out in front of everybody or in front of Mr. Wordsworth, but this humor of character situation arises when both of them are trying to withhold their own feelings and trying not to laugh before the other one does. So that would be a situation as an example of humor of character. And give you an example of a humor of language. Um, if you look at the very bottom of uh, the first, let's not call it a large section, the first section one. At the bottom of section one, you see Mr. Wordsworth left his desk rapidly and went to the window. Turning his back on Jerome, he shook a little with emotion. Now, when you read this, when it says he shook a little with emotion, you know very well it was not emotion of sadness. He was actually wanting to laugh, and he didn't want to laugh in front of Jerome, so he gets up and walks away to the window and pretends like he's crying, but he's actually laughing. But at the end of this first section, Jerome says, "What happened to the pig?" That would be your humor of language because it's kind of like a play on words, and Jerome finally brings about what he really in the end wanted to say. He's not really worried about his father. He must be worried about his father, but he's very curious. Did that pig even live after landing on his father? Was he huge? What kind of a pig was this? So that would be then your humor of language. Um, so take a look once again at the three different kinds of humors that are being referred to by Graham Greene, and understand that even though this might seem a little awkward of a reading to you, it was written during the modernistic time where people were living in an awkward time, and although there was so much of sadness around them, people were trying to bring humor out of every situation that they could, and this is just an example of one such situation. I hope this was helpful to you. If you have any other questions in regards to the part that we did go over, please feel free to get in touch with me.